Hey guys, tonight we wander through castle halls where the torchlight flickers against cold stone and every echo of your boots sounds like the world is hollow inside. But before you admire the tapestries or polish a suit of armor in your imagination, let me remind you, medieval life is not a fairy tale. It's messy, smelly, and downright bizarre at times. You probably won't survive this little stroll, not without some sturdy shoes and maybe a strong stomach. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. I'd love for you to post your location and the local time down below. I always get a kick out of seeing who's tuning in from where. Now, dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You're standing in a castle tower. It looks impressive from the outside, tall, stone, a symbol of power. But here's the less romantic part. Many towers came with something called a garderobe. Sounds fancy, right? Like a wardrobe or a place to store nightly cloaks. Nope. A garderobe is basically a medieval toilet built directly into the wall, with a chute dropping waste straight down the side of the castle. If you thought toilets in towers sounded odd, you're about to imagine the world's least glamorous bathroom experience. You shuffle to a narrow slit in the stone. It's a tiny cubicle, cold, drafty, with a wooden bench and a hole cut into it. Beneath that hole, a long drop straight down to the moat or into a cesspit. Romantic candlelit evenings by the window? Not exactly. Imagine sitting there on a frosty morning, wind whistling up from the shaft, while you try to take care of business. Historians still argue whether garderobes doubled as defensive features. Did attackers really get showered with waste if they tried climbing the walls? Some chroniclers hint that, yes, unpleasant surprises awaited anyone scaling a fortress at the wrong spot. The mainstream fact here, castles needed these waste systems because chamber pots alone couldn't serve dozens or even hundreds of residents. Plumbing as we know it didn't exist, and so castle architects incorporated these vertical shafts, which often just dumped directly into rivers or ditches. Sanitation wasn't exactly the strong suit of the Middle Ages. Now here's the quirky tidbit. Garderobes weren't only toilets. Sometimes people used them for storage, particularly clothing. Why? Because the ammonia and fumes from waste supposedly kept moths away. That means your medieval doublet or gown might have hung right above a chute full of you-know-what. The next time you complain about a musty closet smell, just remember the medieval upgrade. As you lean closer, you notice that not every castle dweller had equal access to these luxuries. Servants often relied on simple buckets or pits, which were emptied, if you were lucky, by gong farmers. These were the brave, underpaid souls who shoveled out cesspits by hand, usually at night. Their pay was decent, but the stench followed them everywhere. Imagine trying to make friends when people cross the street because you reek of castle sewage. One medieval joke suggested that gong farmers never needed attack dogs. No thief would come close enough. There's also the open question of safety. Archaeologists have found garderobe chutes that doubled as secret entrances or weak points in castle defenses. Was it common for spies or soldiers to sneak in through waste shafts? Historians still argue whether this was practical or just a juicy legend repeated in chronicles. But if you think about it, it makes a strange kind of sense. The least guarded entrance would be the one no knight wanted to stand near. Picture this. You're an invading soldier trudging through mud, and suddenly your captain says, "We're climbing through that hole." Romantic idea of chivalry? Out the window. And speaking of windows, many garderobes were designed as little jutting stone chambers sticking out from the castle wall. That way, the waste dropped neatly outside the foundation instead of seeping in. Walk around a ruined castle today, and you might spot one, a tiny stone box projecting from the wall, sometimes with its chute still visible. Next time you see a medieval castle in a travel brochure, just know that some of those picturesque turrets were actually bathrooms. It's funny, too, how medieval people viewed privacy differently. These garderobes were often communal, not single occupancy. You might be sitting side by side with another castle resident, chatting about the weather or the latest jousting gossip while you both, well, you get the idea. Imagine small talk in that setting. How's your stew sitting with you? Oh, fine, thanks. That's a bonding experience no corporate retreat can match. As unpleasant as it sounds, garderobes reflected a deeper truth about the Middle Ages. Daily life revolved around practicality. Waste had to go somewhere. People coped with smells, drafts, and discomfort because survival mattered more than comfort. You start to realize just how far our modern obsession with scented candles and bathroom tiles has taken us. By now, the imagery of a knight in shining armor is wobbling a little. Sure, he looks heroic, riding across the field, but imagine him hustling to the garderobe after a banquet heavy on beans and mead. Not exactly the chivalric image carved into history books. And here's your little third joke to carry into dreams tonight. Medieval castles might have had thick stone walls, but gossip and smells, those traveled faster than a court messenger. You've barely shaken off the image of castle garderobes when another scene creeps in. A wooden courtroom, smoky with tallow candles, villagers pressed shoulder to shoulder, whispering in awe. But the accused isn't a man, it's a pig. Yes, in the Middle Ages, animals could be dragged before judges, tried like criminals, and even sentenced to punishment. You blink because surely this is some medieval prank. But no, the records are there in dusty archives, complete with legal fees and court scribes. Imagine it. The bailiff announces the charges. This sow is accused of eating a child's face. Horrific, yes, but the absurdity deepens when you realize the pig often got a lawyer, a real human lawyer, hired to defend a pig. Historians still argue whether these trials were more symbolic theater than actual justice. Were they meant to teach villagers moral lessons, or were people genuinely convinced that animals carried legal responsibility? The debate continues. The mainstream fact here is undeniable. Medieval Europe, especially France, Switzerland, and parts of Germany, conducted hundreds of these animal trials. They weren't limited to pigs, though pigs appear most often in the records because they lived close to people and sometimes turned violent. Cows, goats, even horses could end up in court. And it didn't stop there. Swarms of rats, beetles, or even locusts might be summoned before a church tribunal. If insects didn't show up to their court date, they could be excommunicated in absentia. That's right. Priests actually cursed bugs for skipping out on trial. Now for the quirky tidbit, sometimes animals won. There are cases where rats were excused because the lawyer argued they couldn't travel safely to court. After all, cats were prowling the roads. The judge, in some bizarre gesture of fairness, acknowledged the danger. You can almost hear the villagers giggling as the verdict was announced. Case dismissed, the rats may stay. That's one for the legal textbooks. The punishments, though, could be brutal. Pigs were sometimes hanged in public, dressed in human clothing to drive home the lesson. Others were burned or even buried alive. It was grisly theater, designed to remind everyone watching that order divine law and human superiority had to be preserved. Picture children in the crowd watching a pig swing from the gallows, a permanent scar branded into their sense of justice. You'd probably whisper to yourself, "What on earth is happening?" while chewing nervously on a crust of rye bread. And there's another layer. These trials blurred the line between law and religion. A cow trampling crops might be seen not only as destruction of property, but as an offense against God's ordained order. So the priest's curses or blessings carried as much weight as the judge's gavel. Historians still debate whether people truly believed the spiritual side or whether it was all a tool for control. Did villagers walk away thinking justice was served, or just entertained by a strange performance? One case stands out like a dark comedy sketch. In 1522, in the French village of Autun, a group of rats was accused of destroying barley fields. They were summoned to court. Their lawyer, Barthélemy Chassaneuse, argued passionately for their right to a fair trial, pointing out that his clients needed safe conduct to travel without risk of predation. The court actually granted a delay, acknowledging the difficulty. It reads like satire, yet it's true. You imagine the villagers laughing and muttering, "Well, that's a new excuse for being late. Sorry, couldn't make it. Cats on the road." Here's the ironic part. The whole system reveals how seriously medieval people took symbolism. Animals embodied sin, chaos, or even demonic influence. By dragging them through human legal rituals, society reaffirmed its own moral framework. But if you're lying there in bed tonight, imagining a goat solemnly standing before a judge, its little hooves clopping nervously on the wooden floorboards, you can't help but chuckle. Somewhere, a bailiff is reading charges aloud in Latin while the goat stares blankly, chewing on its own indictment. Some historians argue that these trials served as catharsis. When a child was killed by an animal, the community couldn't process grief without a ritual of justice. Blaming the pig made the loss less unbearable. But others say it was all theater, a way for officials to showcase their power in front of the peasants. You picture the lord of the manor leaning back smugly, thinking, "Justice is served. Also, dinner is pork." As the torches gutter in the courtroom and the verdict echoes across stone walls, you realize just how strange medieval priorities could be. They lived in a world where superstition, religion, and law tangled together so tightly that no one could tell where one ended and the other began. And here's your soft joke to drift on. In the Middle Ages, if your chicken misbehaved, you didn't just scold it, you hired a lawyer. Imagine trying to explain that legal bill to your landlord. Oh, the rooster needed representation. The courtroom fades away, and you find yourself in a narrow cobbled street where whispers of disease ride on the chill air. You glance up, and here comes a figure that seems pulled straight from a nightmare. A tall man in a black robe, leather gloves, and most unnerving of all, a long bird-like mask with glassy eye holes. The plague doctor has arrived. At first glance, he looks almost theatrical, like someone preparing for a masquerade ball gone horribly wrong. But this isn't about style, it's survival, or at least their best attempt. The mask's beak wasn't just creepy decoration, it was stuffed with herbs, spices, and dried flowers, lavender, roses, cloves, anything thought to purify the foul miasma believed to carry disease. You picture yourself peeking inside that beak, finding a sachet of mint leaves and maybe a little vinegar sponge. Historians still argue whether the mask offered any real protection or if it was just a medieval placebo, a fancy scented air freshener strapped to your face. Here's the mainstream fact. During the Black Death in the 14th century, physicians and self-styled healers used this bizarre uniform as armor against contagion. The waxed leather coats were meant to repel bodily fluids, while the beak was a portable filter. They carried long sticks, not only to examine patients from a distance, but also to poke, prod, and sometimes shoo away desperate crowds. Imagine visiting a doctor today who checks your pulse with a broom handle. Now for the quirky tidbit, plague doctors didn't just treat the sick. Sometimes they doubled as accountants and death recorders, documenting who had died, who had survived, and what property needed redistributing. In other words, they were part physician, part grim bureaucrat. Picture knocking on your door during quarantine, and instead of a nurse offering medicine, it's a plague doctor with a clipboard saying, "Sorry, just here to count your family." Not exactly bedside manner. The suit became iconic, but not every region used it. In fact, the full bird mask design is more common in later centuries, especially the 17th. Some historians even argue it's been exaggerated by art and pop culture, since earlier plague doctors often wore simpler protective gear. Still, enough descriptions survive to know the image wasn't pure myth. And let's be honest, no medieval horror movie director could have invented something creepier. You imagine wandering through a plague-stricken town, houses shuttered, doors marked with crosses, and suddenly this masked figure gliding by. The mask's beak swings slightly as he walks, like some giant crow inspecting carrion. Children must have been terrified. Adults, too. If you saw that silhouette at the end of your street, it probably meant death was only a few houses away. And yet, these doctors weren't always respected. Many were hired from far away, not trusted locals. Some were seen as profiteers, charging high fees during crisis. Their survival rate wasn't impressive either. Plague cut down healers as easily as peasants. It makes you wonder how much comfort their presence really brought. Historians still debate whether people viewed them as saviors or as harbingers of doom. One slightly dark joke drifts in. Medieval plague doctors were basically the original cosplayers, except their convention was the apocalypse. Instead of signing autographs, they signed death records. But here's a softer side to the story. Not all plague-era cures were hopeless. While bloodletting and leeches did more harm than good, some herbal mixtures in those beaks, like rosemary or wormwood, actually repel insects, which carry disease. Did the masks offer a sliver of real protection? Maybe. The science wasn't understood, but the instinct to shield against unseen threats was there. You can almost hear the scrape of boots on cobblestones, the faint rattle of herbs inside the beak, and the hush that falls over neighbors as the doctor approaches. Behind those glass eye holes, who knows what expression hides? Fear, determination, or maybe just exhaustion. By now you can't help but picture lying in bed with that mask leaning over you, the beak dipping close as a muffled voice asks, "How long have you had the cough?" Not exactly the comforting visit you'd want when you're feverish. Still, the costume lingers in our imagination centuries later. It's become shorthand for medieval dread, for the thin line between superstition and science. You realize that in a world without germ theory, people did what they could. They armored themselves with leather, stuffed their noses with lavender, and hoped death would pass them by. And here's your final gentle chuckle. At least medieval plague doctors never had to argue about face mask mandates on social media. Their beaks spoke for themselves. The image of that beaked doctor fades, but the smell sticks in your nose, herbs and leather giving way to something far less pleasant. You're sitting at a rough-hewn table in a dim tavern, where the air is heavy with smoke and sweat. A bowl of stew is plunked in front of you, thick and brown, with chunks of mystery meat. Alongside it comes a hunk of bread, coarse and gritty, and a mug of ale so cloudy you can't see the bottom. Welcome to dinner in the Middle Ages. Here's the mainstream fact. Medieval diets weren't entirely grim. Wealthy nobles could feast on venison, swan, or peacocks served with exotic spices. But for ordinary people, bread and ale were the staples, every single day, sometimes 3 times a day, and not soft bakery loaves or golden lagers. We're talking heavy, dark bread made with barley, rye, or oats, often mixed with fillers like ground beans, acorns, or even sawdust when times were lean. Your teeth crunch down and you realize it's not just the seeds making that texture. The flour itself is full of grit from stone mills, which wore down into the meal. Over a lifetime, people's teeth ground down to nubs. So when you bite into that slice, you're also chewing little bits of medieval millstone. Now for the quirky tidbit, sometimes bread and ale carried a bonus ingredient you didn't order: mold, fungus, or even animal droppings. Rats scampered freely through granaries, cats prowled the ovens, and bakers weren't winning any hygiene awards. There are accounts of people finding hares, beetles, or worse baked right in. Imagine breaking your loaf and discovering a small, crispy surprise. And don't even ask about ale. It wasn't filtered, it wasn't pasteurized, and sometimes it had floating clumps that looked like something you'd skim off a swamp. But hey, it was safer than drinking the water, which could carry deadly disease. Historians still argue whether medieval peasants constantly lived on the brink of malnutrition or whether their diet, rough as it was, actually provided decent calories. Some studies suggest the medieval peasant ate more whole grains and fewer processed foods than many modern people. Others argue famine and poor harvests left entire communities on starvation rations for years at a time. The truth probably lies somewhere between, some years hardy, others desperate. You take another sip of ale, weak, barely alcoholic, brewed to kill bacteria rather than get you drunk. Even children drank it. Imagine your 8-year-old cousin bringing a mug of small beer to school lunch. That's medieval normal. The stronger stuff was reserved for festivals, and yes, the drunken brawls that followed were legendary. And here's where your nose wrinkles. Bread could actually be dangerous. Rye, when damp and moldy, sometimes carried a fungus called ergot. Eating ergot-contaminated bread caused hallucinations, convulsions, even death. Some historians link outbreaks of dancing plagues and witch-hunting hysteria to entire villages tripping on bad bread. You picture yourself at the tavern table, chewing away, when suddenly your neighbor leaps up and starts flailing wildly to invisible music. Did he go mad, or just eat a tainted slice? Nobody could tell. The tavern crowd doesn't seem to mind the rough fare. People dip their bread into pottage, a kind of eternal stew simmering in a cauldron day after day. Whatever ingredients were available, cabbage, onions, leftover scraps of meat, went into the pot, sometimes thickened with yesterday's bread. You realize the pot never truly empties, only gets topped up, like a medieval slow cooker that never stops bubbling. Some joked that a peasant stew was older than he was, and here's your lighter chuckle. If you asked for the soup of the day, The answer was always yes. But let's not forget the nobles upstairs. Their feasts glittered with roasted birds redressed in their feathers, pies hiding live doves that fluttered out when cut, and spices like cinnamon or saffron imported at shocking cost. Yet even their food wasn't free from hazards. Overspiced meat sometimes covered up rot, and the glittering sugar statues were made from tooth-rotting lumps. And yes, even kings got food poisoning. Henry VIII, for example, was notorious for his digestive woes, though to be fair, that might have been from eating swan pie 5 nights a week. Back in the tavern, you're left gnawing the crust, feeling the grit on your teeth, and sipping the ale that tastes faintly of sour apples. It fills your belly, but comfort food it is not. And yet, people survived on this. They laughed, they sang, they told stories around tables sticky with spilled ale, because in the end, survival wasn't about taste. It was about calories. As you push the bread aside, one last thought tickles in. Medieval food may not have been Instagram-worthy, but at least it came without confusing menu boards. Today's special: bread, stew, and ale. Same as yesterday, same as tomorrow. The clatter of bowls fades, and now you're standing in a narrow, smoky cottage, the air thick with herbs dangling from rafters. A single wooden tub squats in the corner, its planks warped from years of use. You might think, finally, a chance to wash that gritty bread out of my teeth. But don't get your hopes up. Bathing in the Middle Ages wasn't what you'd call frequent or pleasant. Here's the mainstream fact. Many people in medieval Europe bathed rarely, sometimes just once or twice a year. Yes, you heard that right. Once a year. The reasons varied. For one, hauling water, heating it, and filling a tub was exhausting work. Most peasants couldn't afford to waste firewood on warming water when it was needed for cooking or heating the house. And then, during outbreaks of plague, public authorities even discouraged bathing, believing hot water opened the pores and made people vulnerable to bad air. Imagine being told that scrubbing yourself might invite disease, not prevent it. But here's the quirky tidbit. Despite the stereotype of filthy medieval folk, some towns actually had public bathhouses, and they were surprisingly popular in certain periods. Families, merchants, and even couples went together, lounging in warm tubs like a proto-spa day. These bathhouses often doubled as social centers and, let's be honest, sometimes as places of questionable morality. So while the idea of never bathing holds truth, the full picture was more complicated. Wealthier townsfolk might bathe weekly or monthly, especially before a feast day or festival. Still, out in rural villages, a yearly scrub really could be the norm. Historians still argue whether medieval people truly stank as badly as we imagine. On one side, records suggest frequent complaints about foul odors, rivers used as open sewers, and herbs stuffed in pockets to mask smells. On the other, it's argued that people grew accustomed to the constant musk of sweat, smoke, and earth. What was nauseating to us may have just been home to them. You kneel by the wooden tub. It's not filled with steaming bubbles, but with lukewarm, gray water that's already been used by 3 other family members. The phrase, "Don't throw the baby out with the bathwater," suddenly makes perfect sense. By the time the baby got its turn, the water was practically sludge. You gag a little, imagining dipping into that soup of soap, dirt, and hair. But it was precious. Water wasn't wasted. People made do. Instead of frequent baths, folks turned to other tricks. Sprigs of rosemary, lavender, or mint were tucked into clothes to ward off stink. Linen undergarments were changed more often than bodies were scrubbed. since linen absorbed sweat. In fact, laundering shirts in shifts was considered more important than washing skin. So, in a strange way, cleanliness was measured by the state of your underwear. You can't help but laugh softly at that. Imagine bragging at the tavern. Look, clean shift. Who needs a bath? And perfumes weren't reserved for nobles alone. Even peasants might rub herbs on their hands or burn sweet wood chips indoors. Of course, these scents were more cover-up than cure. A sweaty knight could spritz rosewater, but underneath the armor he still smelled well, like a sweaty knight. There's also the ritual aspect. Pilgrims sometimes bathed before holy journeys, and brides were encouraged to bathe before marriage. But again, bathe didn't always mean a full soak. It could mean a quick rinse of hands, feet, and face. Medieval people considered that good enough. Still, there's one odd detail that makes you grin. Some manuals suggested bathing in wine or vinegar as a health treatment. Imagine dunking yourself in a barrel of red wine, convinced it would cure your fever. Modern spa treatments sound luxurious, but they've got nothing on a peasant half-soaking in sour ale. You sniff the air again, trying to catch any whiff of soap. True soap did exist, made from lye and animal fat, but it was harsh, often drying the skin. Olive oil-based soaps from the Mediterranean were softer, but expensive. For most folks, scrubbing with sand or ashes was the go-to method. You picture yourself rubbing your arms with gritty ash, muttering, "Well, at least I'm exfoliated." And here's a curious debate. Were medieval people truly dirtier than their ancient Roman ancestors with their famous baths? Some historians argue that bathing culture in Europe collapsed after the fall of Rome, replaced by suspicion of public baths. Others point out that Romans and medieval folk alike had their share of grime, lice, and smells. Maybe the difference is that Romans made a party of bathing, while medieval peasants kept it low-key. Very, very low-key. So tonight, as you stretch under your clean sheets, just remember, somewhere in the 14th century, a whole family is sharing the same murky tub, scrubbing once in December, then settling back into a year of herbs, linen, and good old-fashioned musk. And here's your soft laugh before drifting off. At least medieval people didn't stress about deodorant brands. Their slogan could have been, "One bath a year, make it count." The cottage air grows thick and fades into silence, and suddenly you find yourself in a graveyard. The night is cool, the moon silver, and the ground beneath your feet uneven with old stones. You expect peace here, but instead, the earth feels unsettled. That's because in the Middle Ages, death wasn't always final the first time around. People feared being buried alive, and with good reason. Here's the mainstream fact. Medical knowledge back then couldn't always distinguish between deep unconsciousness and death. Comas, catalepsy, even severe illness could leave someone pale, stiff, and unresponsive. Without stethoscopes or proper checks for a pulse, mourners sometimes assumed their loved one was gone too soon, and so coffins occasionally sealed the living. You shiver, imagining the first scrape of dirt hitting the lid while the person inside slowly realizes they're not in heaven yet. Now for the quirky tidbit. To combat this fear, some graves were fitted with safety coffins. These contraptions included bells or tubes leading to the surface. If the dead woke up underground, they could tug a cord and ring for help. Picture a medieval churchyard at midnight, bell towers silent, until a faint tinkling rises from beneath the earth. You'd sprint away faster than a knight fleeing a dragon. Historians still argue how common premature burial really was. Some point to scattered records and folk tales as proof it happened often enough to terrify communities. Others suggest the fear was greater than the reality, and that safety coffins were rare gimmicks for the wealthy. But the debate itself shows how uneasy medieval people were with death, so certain of its inevitability, yet never entirely trusting its finality. You kneel by a fresh mound. Imagine the coffin inside, rough wood, narrow, filled with straw. Funerals were quick affairs, especially during plague years. Bodies piled faster than priests could chant. Sometimes in the rush, people weren't checked thoroughly. That explains the legends of claw marks inside coffins or corpses found twisted in panic. Were those true cases or just exaggerated tales to keep people whispering by the fire? We'll never know for sure, and yet, for all the fear, medieval folk surrounded burials with ritual. Bells rang not only from safety devices but from church towers to ward off evil spirits. Graves were sprinkled with holy water, candles lit, prayers murmured. A person might be buried with charms or coins to bribe heavenly gatekeepers. In some places, iron bars were even laid over graves, not to keep spirits in, but to keep witches and ghouls out. Death was never simple. You picture yourself as a villager waking in the night to the sound of a faint bell from the churchyard. Do you rush to dig, or do you mutter a prayer and pretend you heard nothing, terrified it's a ghost calling instead of a neighbor? Either way, your dreams that night aren't going to be restful. There's also a strange twist. In a few cases, people were deliberately buried alive, not by mistake, but as punishment. Criminals or accused witches might be lowered into pits with earth piled slowly on top. Imagine the horror of hearing the crowd above while you sink into silence below. These stories blur fact and folklore, but they fed the same terror that anyone, good or bad, might find themselves trapped under soil too soon. To make matters worse, graveyards weren't as permanent as you'd hope. Bodies were often exhumed after a few years to make room for new burials. Bones were piled in ossuaries or charnel houses, skulls grinning in stacks. If you were accidentally buried alive but didn't ring your bell in time, well, eventually you'd just be another part of the pile. And here's your gentle joke for tonight. At least medieval folks didn't waste money on deluxe coffins. If you were going to need an escape hatch, better to keep the carpentry simple. As you step back from the graves, the wind rattles the trees. Somewhere far off, you almost imagine the faintest ringing. Was it just a sheep bell, or someone tugging desperately from below? Either way, you quicken your pace, because in the Middle Ages, even the grave could not be trusted to stay quiet. Shaking the chill from the graveyard, you wander into a bustling market street, the smell of bread and ale fading, replaced by something sharper, metal, smoke, and the faint tang of iron. Here you notice a man grimacing as he bites down on a leather strap, while a curious onlooker leans in. Welcome to medieval dentistry, where toothaches were serious business and remedies were creative. The mainstream fact is straightforward. Dental care in the Middle Ages was rudimentary at best. Barbers often doubled as tooth pullers, and extraction was the primary solution for pain. There were no anesthetics, just steady hands, ropes, and pliers, or sometimes hammer and chisel. Imagine grimacing as someone yanks a molar out without mercy. The pain was brief but excruciating, followed by weeks of sensitivity and swelling. Historians still argue whether medieval dentistry was purely a form of torture or an earnest attempt at relief. Now for the quirky tidbit, some toothaches were treated with charms or spells rather than hands-on methods. People might recite prayers, burn herbs, or even apply animal fat directly to the gum. One unusual remedy involved wrapping the tooth in the skin of a freshly killed cat, or at least that's what a few manuscripts suggest. You probably won't be adding that to your first aid kit anytime soon. Another popular treatment involved tooth worms, the idea that small worms bored into teeth causing decay. Merchants sold remedies claiming to expel the worms, sometimes with substances like honey, garlic, or crushed gemstones. You picture someone swishing a gritty, sticky mixture in their mouth, hoping to kill invisible worms while trying not to gag. The barber surgeon was a common figure on market days. In addition to cutting hair and shaving beards, he wielded instruments for bloodletting, minor surgeries, and dental extractions. Imagine sitting in that chair while the barber hums a tune, clamps a plier to your molar, and pulls. No numbing, just sheer grit. At least you could admire his multitasking skill. A few wealthy individuals attempted more refined dentistry. Gold and silver fillings were occasionally used, and monks experimented with herbal pastes to ease pain or slow decay. Yet even their techniques were limited, and many people simply lost teeth early in life. You might see a village elder with half their teeth missing, smiling through gaps that modern dentists would never allow. And there's an oddly amusing ritual. Some believed that applying a rooster's spittle to the gums could stop a toothache. You try to imagine a 12-year-old beak pecking their sore molar while the family watches, nodding in solemn approval. Somewhere in that crowd, a child is undoubtedly thinking, "I hope this works, or at least it's less painful than pliers." The danger wasn't limited to pain. Infections could spread, turning a simple extraction into a life-threatening event. Historians still argue whether these deaths were rare accidents or a frequent consequence of medieval procedures. Without antiseptics or clean instruments, every cut or pulled tooth carried serious risk. And yet, life went on. People ate, they worked, they laughed, and their gums suffered silently. You look around the crowded street and spot a traveling dentist's stall, instruments glinting in the sunlight. You almost want to admire the craftsmanship until you remember the patient with a mouth wide open, eyes squeezed shut as pliers clamp down. One small grimace, and you're reminded why dentists became both revered and feared. For a light chuckle, medieval dentists were essentially multitasking barbers with a flair for amateur surgery. Shave, trim, extract a tooth. Why not? Finally, you consider this. Despite all the pain, medieval dentistry reveals resilience. People endured discomfort with ingenuity, using whatever tools, herbs, or charms were at hand. It wasn't pretty, but it was survival. And somewhere, a brave villager grits their teeth, literally, waiting for the next plier to snap. You shake off the memory of the grim dental stall and wander into a castle's private chambers, where plush rugs cover stone floors and sunlight streams through leaded windows. At first glance, it seems serene, almost cozy. But then you notice something odd. A small dog curled up on the queen's lap, a squirrel perched on a side table, and a monkey dangling from a tapestry. Pets in royal beds were not unusual, and yes, people actually slept alongside them. Here's the mainstream fact. Medieval nobles often kept animals for companionship, hunting, or status symbols. Dogs were common, prized for loyalty and agility, while falcons or hunting birds doubled as practical tools for sport. Cats were valued for rodent control, though they sometimes enjoyed a bit of the chamber warmth. Historians still argue whether animals in beds were indulgent luxuries or standard comforts for the wealthy. Either way, the practice was surprisingly common. Now for the quirky tidbit, some nobles kept exotic pets, including monkeys, peacocks, or even small bears. These animals roamed halls, sometimes chewing on furniture or stealing food, yet were considered part of the household. You can imagine the queen waking in the night to a paw in her hair or a squirrel nibbling her slippers. Utter chaos hidden behind elegant curtains. The mental image is oddly endearing and slightly terrifying. Pets weren't only for comfort, they played social and political roles. A well-bred dog could impress visiting dignitaries. A falcon's grace demonstrated skill and status. Even exotic animals like monkeys signaled connections with distant lands and trade networks. Imagine a diplomat bowing, only to be startled by a capuchin leaping from the fireplace mantel. Commoners, meanwhile, had simpler companions, cats, chickens, or dogs. But even these animals sometimes shared sleeping spaces. Fireplaces were cold in winter, straw bedding scarce, and a warm animal body could be a literal lifesaver. And yes, fleas came along for the ride. Historians still debate whether this was tolerable or just an accepted risk for warmth. Royal pet anecdotes are full of charm. One tale recounts a monkey stealing silverware during a banquet, only to be politely chased off by a lady-in-waiting. Another describes a dog so attached to its owner that it followed the king into the bathroom. Imagine the scandal, or at least the laughter, among courtiers. And here's a light joke. If you think your dog hogs the bed today, try sharing it with a hedgehog or a miniature bear. Good luck getting any sleep. Beyond amusement, these pets reveal medieval perspectives on companionship, control, and affection. They were more than status symbols. They were part of the rhythm of daily life. A sleeping dog, a purring cat, or a mischievous monkey could ease stress, comfort the lonely, or even distract a ruler from political tension. By the time you leave the chamber, you can almost hear the rustle of fur, the squeak of tiny claws on stone floors, and the gentle snore of a well-loved hound. In this strange, tactile way, animals brought warmth, laughter, and a touch of chaos into lives that could otherwise be rigidly formal and frighteningly structured. And for a soft chuckle before drifting, medieval royalty may have ruled kingdoms, but their pets definitely ruled the bed. You step outside, leaving the warmth of the chamber behind, and find yourself in a medieval city street that smells sharply of life, labor, and waste. The narrow lanes are crowded, muddy, and chaotic. But the most striking feature is not the throng of people, it's the dung. Human excrement piles up in streets, alleys, and courtyards, a constant reminder that sanitation was not yet a priority. Here's the mainstream fact. Medieval cities lacked organized sewer systems. Residents often tossed chamber pots out of windows directly onto the street. Horses, pigs, and dogs added to the mess. You trudge carefully to avoid stepping into something squishy, and it's immediately obvious that cleanliness was a relative term. Historians still argue whether these conditions were universally unbearable or simply tolerated as part of urban life. In some cities, regulations existed, but enforcement was patchy at best. Now for the quirky tidbit, pigs roamed freely in many towns, acting as living garbage disposals. They consumed leftovers, scraps, and yes, human waste. Imagine a medieval traffic jam where a sow waddles past, sniffing for breakfast among the debris. Citizens adapted, stepping lightly and carrying sticks or boots to defend against wandering pigs. It was a constant negotiation with nature, your shoes, and the occasional aggressive swine. City planners attempted crude solutions. Some streets had runners, workers responsible for dragging night soil out to dumping areas or rivers. These gong farmers or muck rakers worked at night, wielding long hooks and carts, often paid surprisingly well for such a disgusting task. You can picture their routine, stooping low under moonlight, scooping, scraping, and cursing while trying not to wake the entire street with the racket. And here's a subtle horror. During wet seasons, streets became a slurry of mud, urine, and excrement. Children played cautiously, vendors sloshed through it with baskets balanced on heads, and horses slipped spectacularly. Historians still debate whether disease outbreaks, cholera, dysentery, were directly worsened by this, though evidence strongly points to a clear connection. Survival required constant awareness of the immediate environment. Interestingly, the city dung had a secret benefit. Farmers outside the walls eagerly collected night soil as fertilizer, enriching fields with nutrients from human waste. So, in a strange circular logic, the stench in the streets contributed to the next season's bread. Imagine standing ankle-deep in muck, knowing that somewhere out there your excrement will feed someone else's rye. It's both revolting and practical, a medieval eco-cycle in action, and a small chuckle for your imagination. At least in medieval cities, your dog never had to worry about dog parks. The entire city was a playground, and a buffet rolled into one. By the time you duck into a side alley to avoid a waiting cartload of refuse, you notice the architecture attempting to rise above the filth. Overhanging upper stories created shadows that offered some respite from the summer sun. Shops hung signs with painted symbols, no literacy needed, to advertise wares, while cats patrolled roofs, hunting rats that thrived in the muck. It's a world teeming with life, smells, and survival strategies. In these streets, you realize hygiene wasn't luxury. It was negotiation. Every step required attention, every meal might involve luck, and every breath carried the city's combined aromas. Yet, people adapted, thrived, and even laughed in these conditions. It's both shocking and strangely humanizing to imagine walking these lanes yourself. And here's your bedtime grin. If you think city traffic today is messy, imagine dodging carts, pigs, and human waste simultaneously. Medieval urban planning? Brutal. From the fetid streets, you wander into the shadowed halls of a cathedral, where sunlight filters through colored glass and illuminates dust motes like drifting stars. But your eyes are drawn downward to something curious lodged in the walls. Tiny shoes, locks of hair, scraps of fabric. These are medieval protective charms, often hidden in construction or behind altar stones. Here's the mainstream fact. People in the Middle Ages frequently concealed objects in buildings to ward off evil. Shoes, nails, coins, and other personal items were placed in walls, chimneys, or foundations. The belief was that the object's presence could protect the home or church from misfortune, disease, or malevolent spirits. Historians still argue whether this practice was more widespread among common folk or if it had serious religious significance in elite construction projects. Now for the quirky tidbit. You might find whole shoes stuffed behind beams, often small children's shoes, sometimes worn down to the sole. Why shoes? The theory is that the human shape trapped in the shoe, particularly that of a child, acted as a magical protector. In a way, it was a silent guardian, hidden but ever present. Imagine a cathedral where every time you looked closely at a wall, you were peering into dozens of tiny forgotten footsteps. Even more peculiar were charms made from hair, fingernails, or tiny textiles. Some were believed to absorb illness or misfortune directly from those who handled them before hiding. Picture a priest secretly placing a lock of his own hair in the wall during construction, muttering prayers and hoping the spirits took the hint. Historians still debate whether these items were purely magical or served as symbolic placeholders during sacred rituals. Churches, though sacred, weren't immune to superstition. Builders and congregants alike worried about evil influences. You might step into a chapel and unknowingly pass by a hair-filled cavity above the altar, a medieval amulet against misfortune. To modern eyes, it's slightly creepy, yet undeniably clever. Some shoes show evidence of repair, suggesting they were worn before being sacrificed for protection. Imagine a tiny tattered shoe once walked in the sun, now pressed into a wall forever, silently guarding the faithful. Other finds include coins with holes drilled for charms, hinting at layered beliefs, wealth, protection, and divine favor intertwined. And here's a gentle chuckle. Imagine a builder whispering, "Just shove this old shoe in the wall. That should keep the devil out." It's practical, if not hygienic. Interestingly, the practice wasn't limited to churches. Homes, barns, and bridges sometimes hid similar objects. The idea was the same: ward off misfortune and ensure safety for inhabitants. You can picture families hoarding a few treasured trinkets only to bury them behind a wall for generations, never to see them again. By the time you step away from the cathedral, the sense of invisible guardians lingers. Tiny shoes, hair locks, and scraps of cloth create a network of unseen protection, bridging superstition and faith. You can almost feel a pulse beneath the stone, a whisper of medieval minds striving to control a world full of unpredictability. And here's your bedtime smile. In a medieval church, even shoes have a purpose beyond feet. They're tiny, silent bodyguards, forever on duty. Leaving the cathedral behind, you wander into a sunlit field where peasants are tending crops, the scent of fresh earth mingling with hay and manure. But what catches your eye isn't the work. It's the strange implements they wield. You spot a man walking backward with a plow, another carrying a small wooden frame with strings stretched across it. Welcome to the world of medieval agriculture, where innovation met superstition in equal measure. Here's the mainstream fact: the heavy plow revolutionized northern European farming. Unlike simple scratch plows, it could turn dense clay soil efficiently, increasing yields and sustaining growing populations. The iron share cut deep, furrows curved predictably, and crop production surged. Historians still argue how quickly this technology spread and whether peasants fully understood the mechanics or simply followed tradition. Now for the quirky tidbit: some farmers practiced horse-led backward plowing for ritualistic reasons. The belief was that turning the soil backward or in a counterintuitive direction would appease spirits, promote fertility, or ward off curses. You can picture villagers standing back, watching a horse strain against the plow, muttering prayers to unseen forces. In modern terms, it looks inefficient, but in their minds, it was essential for a successful harvest. Crop rotation was another innovation. Alternating grains, legumes, and fallow periods preserved soil fertility, though peasants had to memorize complex sequences without calculators or spreadsheets. You imagine someone leaning against a furrowed ridge, scratching notes into the dirt with a stick, mentally tracking the land's productivity. And yet, superstition never left the fields. Farmers sometimes buried charms like stones or nails beneath the soil, hoping to drive away pests or encourage growth. They consulted local wise women or priests about the optimal timing of planting and harvesting. Certain days of the week, moon phases, or even weather signs were thought to influence the success of crops. Historians still debate how much these practices actually improved yields or if they were largely symbolic. Livestock also had quirks. Oxen were preferred for plowing, yet rituals governed their use. Some farmers believed that whistling at oxen would make them stubborn, while others claimed singing sacred chants calmed them. You imagine a plowman singing off-key into the wind, trying to coax a reluctant animal through thick mud. And here's a light joke. Medieval farmers probably spent more time negotiating with oxen than with landlords. Famine loomed as a constant threat. Poor harvests could mean death, and yet innovation and tradition balanced delicately. Peasants mixed survival techniques with superstition because it was pragmatic. If nothing else worked, at least you'd feel like you tried everything. You glance across the field and see a scarecrow-like figure draped in rags, meant to ward off crows. Perhaps it's meant to symbolize human ingenuity, superstition, and the desperate hope that some trick, some ritual will save the harvest. It's both charming and eerie. By the time you leave the field, the smell of fresh soil clings faintly to your clothes, and you can almost feel the rhythm of medieval toil, the hard work, the rituals, the clever and absurd ways people sought to wrest sustenance from the earth, and your soft bedtime grin. In medieval farming, sometimes the magic worked better than the plow. The open fields give way to a dense forest, its canopy thick enough that sunlight barely reaches the moss-covered floor. You hear twigs snap underfoot and the distant call of a hawk, but something else catches your attention. Signs of hunting. Snares, traps, and carefully carved notches on trees hint at the medieval obsession with game. Hunting wasn't just sport. It was survival, status, and sometimes downright bizarre. Here's the mainstream fact. Nobles engaged in organized hunting as both a pastime and a method to train for war. Deer, boar, and birds were common quarry, pursued with hounds, bows, or crossbows. Hunting regulations were strict. Forests were often legally protected, and poaching could carry severe punishment. Historians still argue whether these laws primarily protected resources or served to enforce social hierarchies. Now for the quirky tidbit, some hunts included live baiting, a practice that today would make you squirm. For example, small animals were sometimes tied to stakes to attract larger predators. The thrill of seeing the chase unfold was part of the entertainment. Imagine a noble sipping spiced wine as a fox, tethered by fate, darts across the clearing, pursued by dogs. Morally questionable? Absolutely. Entertaining to them? Clearly. Peasants had their own hunting traditions, often secretive due to legal restrictions. Poaching was a risky but necessary way to supplement meager rations. A rabbit or a pheasant could mean the difference between hunger and a full stomach. Some clever hunters used traps that doubled as puzzles, hiding snares with brush or camouflaging nets among trees. Historians still debate how widespread these ingenious but illegal methods were, though folklore suggests they were common enough to inspire cautionary tales. Hunting also intersected with medicine and superstition. Deer antlers, boar tusks, and even feathers were believed to carry healing properties. You might stumble across a trapper proudly carrying a stag's antler to grind into powders or charms. Herbalists combined these animal parts with plants to create remedies, mixing superstition with the practical knowledge of blood, bone, and sinew. And here's a small amusing detail. Some nobles kept hunting monkeys, trained to flush birds from thickets. The image of a capuchin tugging on a pheasant's tail as a dog chases both through the forest is delightfully absurd, yet recorded in historical manuscripts. Hunting was also a social event. Hunts lasted for days with feasts, games, and competitions. Noblemen showcased skill, wealth, and prestige. Meanwhile, peasants observed from the edges, sometimes risking punishment to glimpse the spectacle. The forest became a theater where law, leisure, and livelihood intersected in unpredictable ways. As dusk falls, you imagine the scent of campfires, leather, and game filling the air. The echo of horns and the rustle of hounds' paws accompany the fading light. In this world, survival, status, and superstition are intertwined, and every snap of a twig might carry the thrill of a hunt or the threat of trouble. And for your soft bedtime smile, in medieval forests, both humans and animals were starring in a drama, complete with suspense, chaos, and the occasional mischievous monkey sidekick. Leaving the forest behind, you step into a shadowy workshop, the scent of soot and metal hanging in the air. Hammers clang rhythmically, sparks leap from anvils, and a blacksmith wipes sweat from his brow with a soot-stained sleeve. The trade is brutal, unrelenting, and essential, but there's more going on here than you expect. Welcome to the world of medieval craftsmanship, where skill, superstition, and sheer endurance collide. Here's the mainstream fact. Blacksmiths were central to medieval life. They forged tools, weapons, horseshoes, and household items, their work powering agriculture, defense, and daily living. A strong arm, steady eye, and knowledge of metal properties were indispensable. Historians still argue how apprenticeships varied regionally, but most agree that the craft was rigorously learned over years of toil. Now for the quirky tidbit. Some blacksmiths believed that hammers, anvils, and furnaces had spirits or moods. They would ritually touch or bless tools before beginning, lest a bad omen ruin their work. Sparks flying from a forge were sometimes seen as auspicious or dangerous. Too many might mean ill fortune, too few, and the metal might reject the heat. You can picture a smith muttering, "Sorry, old friend, don't be cranky today," as he hammers a sword into shape. Metallurgy itself was a blend of science and experimentation. Smiths learned to temper steel with fire and water, discovering patterns through trial, error, and observation. They might sprinkle ashes, salt, or even urine onto hot metal to achieve specific effects, believing that certain rituals improved strength or resilience. Historians still debate whether these methods had real scientific merit or were mostly symbolic, yet some undeniably influenced the metal's properties. Blacksmithing wasn't without risk. Sparks, flying shrapnel, and molten metal could cause horrific burns, but accidents were accepted as part of the craft. You imagine the apprentice flinching as molten iron sprays nearby, learning to survive as much as to shape. Protective gear was minimal: leather aprons, gloves, and grit, mostly grit. And here's a small humorous detail. Some smiths kept lucky charms in their workshops, coins, rabbit's feet, or carved figures stashed near anvils or furnace doors. You can almost see the master smith winking at his apprentice. "Don't forget to feed the iron spirits tonight." Beyond tools and weapons, blacksmiths were crucial to architecture. Nails, hinges, and lock mechanisms were all forged in their fiery hearths. A castle's survival could depend on a blacksmith's skill, and villages relied on them to keep wagons rolling and plows turning. In essence, these men and women were quiet lifelines for their communities. By the time you step out of the workshop, soot-streaked and ears ringing, you realize that medieval blacksmiths were alchemists, mechanics, and mystics rolled into one. Sparks didn't just shape metal, they shaped survival, security, and sometimes superstition. And for your bedtime grin, in medieval towns, the blacksmith's hammer was not just a tool. It was a musical warning to nearby fingers. You leave the rhythmic clanging of the blacksmith behind and wander into a shadowed corridor of a medieval hospital, or more accurately, a place attempting to be a hospital. Candles sputter along stone walls, illuminating narrow beds and low benches. The scent of herbs, ointments, and something decidedly foul hangs thick in the air. Care and science mix haphazardly here, and the results are unpredictable at best. Here's the mainstream fact. Medieval hospitals existed, often run by monastic orders or charitable guilds. They cared for the sick, the poor, and travelers. Unlike modern hospitals, treatment was less about medicine and more about comfort, prayer, and containment. Historians still argue whether hospitals were primarily places of healing, shelters for the destitute, or both. Now for the quirky tidbit, leeches were a common sight. Bloodletting was a standard treatment, believed to balance humors and restore health. You might see a patient reclined, a few leeches attached to their arm, while a monk whispers prayers and another mixes herbal poultices. If you're squeamish, don't look too closely, though some patients reported relief afterward. In certain cases, doctors even prescribed urine tasting or potions made from crushed insects. The hospitals were overcrowded, understaffed, and often smelled sharply of decay. Linen was rarely washed, floors swept once a day at best, and diseases spread quickly. Patients were sometimes quarantined by severity of illness, but privacy was almost non-existent. Historians still debate how effective hygiene practices were, though it's clear they were minimal by today's standards. Interestingly, some hospitals had ingenious systems for the time. Bells were installed so patients could call attendants without leaving their beds. Herbs and flowers hung from ceilings to mask odors and ward off disease. And certain monasteries maintained rudimentary pharmacies with crushed plants, minerals, and sometimes animal parts, blending superstition with empirical observation. And here's a softer chuckle. One popular remedy involved carrying a live frog over the body to draw out illness. Picture an exhausted patient lying on a narrow bed, a warty frog perched on their stomach while the nurse mutters encouragement. It's weird, yet it reflects the era's inventive, if desperate, approach to healing. Food was minimal, usually gruel, bread, and weak ale. Patients often supplemented their diets with what family could provide, but famine, disease, and scarcity meant many left hospitals weaker than when they arrived. Despite this, hospitals offered shelter, prayers, and an organized form of care that was rare for ordinary citizens. As you walk among the narrow beds, you notice faint murmurs, prayers, moans, the scratch of quills on parchment. People were trying to survive with limited understanding, combining practical treatments with hope, superstition, and human care. And for a gentle bedtime note, medieval hospitals might not have cured everything, but they offered warmth, attention, and an oddly comforting ritual to those navigating sickness. Even the frogs had a role in keeping spirits, and perhaps patience, alive. You step out of the hospital's dim halls and find yourself in a shadowed chapel, the scent of incense heavy in the air. Candles flicker along carved stone walls, illuminating a wooden pulpit where a monk reads aloud from a thick manuscript. But what catches your attention is less the sermon and more the presence of death, a collection of skulls and bones arranged meticulously along the walls. Welcome to the world of medieval mortuary practices, where the living and dead coexisted in ways that might surprise you. Here's the mainstream fact. The church controlled burial practices, with cemeteries often attached to churches or monasteries. Funerals were brief, emphasizing prayers for the dead rather than lavish ceremonies, except among the nobility. Historians still argue whether these practices reflected deep religious devotion or a pragmatic approach to population density and disease management. Now for the quirky tidbit, ossuaries, rooms stacked with bones, were common in many regions. Entire walls could be covered with skulls, femurs, and vertebrae, sometimes arranged decoratively. Some communities even painted or carved patterns into bones, turning reminders of mortality into art. You can picture standing before a wall of human remains, trying to appreciate the craftsmanship while quietly thinking, maybe too much art for one room. Death was close and constant. Plagues, famine, and warfare meant that people regularly encountered corpses. The concept of memento mori, remember you must die, permeated culture. Skeletons were reminders of life's brevity, prompting moral reflection, prayers, and sometimes black humor. You might overhear a monk muttering, "All our bones will look just like these someday." And here's a light joke. Medieval planners were efficient. They reused graves and sometimes exhumed older remains to make room for new burials. Talk about recycling. Cemeteries were practical too. Graves were dug shallowly, and over time, bones were relocated to ossuaries to prevent overcrowding. You can imagine a team of laborers stacking femurs neatly while muttering about their grim task. Historians still debate whether this practice was primarily spiritual, sanitary, or simply space-saving. Some communities even believed bones carried protective powers. A skull placed above a doorway might ward off evil spirits, and certain relics were said to bring health or luck. Combining superstition with reverence, people treated the dead as both sacred and useful, a stark contrast to modern separation of life and death. In addition, the plague years changed mortuary culture dramatically. Mass graves became common, sometimes hastily dug with minimal ceremony. Despite the horror, communities tried to maintain rituals, candles, prayers, and careful stacking of bones where possible. The mixture of pragmatism and ritual is striking, revealing a society negotiating grief, faith, and survival simultaneously. As you leave the chapel, the faint scent of incense lingers, mingled with the dry, earthy smell of bones. You realize medieval life carried death alongside everyday tasks, an ever-present shadow shaping beliefs, behaviors, and art. And for your soft bedtime smile, in medieval chapels, even the walls could whisper, reminding you gently that life is fleeting, and humor, faith, and creativity endure. You step away from the chapel and find yourself in the dim glow of a scriptorium, the faint smell of ink and parchment filling your nose. Monks bend over desks, quills scratching across thick vellum, copying texts for hours at a stretch. But you notice something odd. Some pages are meticulously illustrated with bizarre creatures, grotesque faces, and playful margins. Clearly, the scribes had a sense of humor, even in sacred work. Here's the mainstream fact. Medieval monasteries were centers of learning and literacy. Monks copied religious texts, chronicles, and classical works, preserving knowledge that might have otherwise vanished. The scriptorium was a hub of painstaking labor where mistakes were corrected with care and dedication. Historians still argue how much of this work reflected genuine devotion versus institutional duty. Now for the quirky tidbit, marginalia, the doodles and illustrations in the margins, often depict the absurd, rabbits jousting, hybrid creatures, monks misbehaving, or humans with exaggerated features. These playful drawings sometimes poke fun at authority or offer commentary on daily life. You can picture a monk snickering behind his parchment as he adds a tiny fox chasing a monk's hat. Illuminated manuscripts were both functional and artistic. Gold leaf, vibrant pigments, and intricate patterns transformed texts into treasures. Yet for all the beauty, scribes endured long hours in dim light, often hunched painfully, with ink-stained fingers and sore eyes. You might think, how did they survive? But survival meant careful rhythm, prayer, and dedication. And here's a small humorous detail. Some scribes included hidden messages, jokes, or critiques of their patrons within the pages. Imagine discovering centuries later that a monk had slyly inserted a caricature of a grumpy abbot smiling in tiny ink. It's a secret rebellion preserved for posterity. Copying texts wasn't limited to religious works. Scientific treatises, medical guides, and classical philosophy were also replicated, blending practical knowledge with superstition and spiritual commentary. Monks sometimes annotated texts with personal notes or warnings, reflecting their observations and beliefs. Historians still debate the accuracy and intent of these annotations, but they reveal a fascinating mix of scholarship and personality. Ink itself was a curious mix of materials: soot, gallnuts, plant extracts, and sometimes even urine, to achieve desired colors and permanence. You can almost see the scribes grimacing as they stir the concoctions, hoping the ink won't ruin the manuscript. By the time you leave the scriptorium, the faint scent of ink and vellum clings to your fingers. You realize these rooms were more than libraries. They were laboratories of imagination, labor, and occasional mischief. Every page preserved knowledge, art, and the subtle humor of those long gone. And your bedtime grin. In medieval manuscripts, the margins might be the only place where the monks truly let loose, proving that even in devotion, a little mischief survives. You leave the quiet scriptorium and find yourself wandering into a lively town square, the air filled with shouting merchants, clanging bells, and the scent of roasting meat. Among the hustle, a public spectacle unfolds, a trial by ordeal. You pause, unsettled yet fascinated. Here, justice isn't delivered by judges and juries alone. It's sometimes in the hands of fire, water, or combat. Here's the mainstream fact. Medieval law included trials by ordeal as a way to determine guilt or innocence. Common methods involved holding a red-hot iron, plunging hands into boiling water, or being submerged in cold water. The belief was that divine intervention would protect the innocent. Historians still argue how frequently these trials were used versus more conventional jury trials. Now for the quirky tidbit, some communities employed highly specific ordeals. For instance, accused witches might be tied and thrown into a river. If they floated, they were guilty. If they sank, sometimes tragically, they were innocent. You can almost picture a crowd craning its necks, murmuring prayers, and exchanging wagers on the outcome. The logic is bizarre, yet it was seriously considered law at the time. In addition to water and fire, Some towns relied on combat as an ordeal. The accused might fight a designated champion, believing divine favor would grant victory to the just party. You imagine a nervous villager squaring off against a burly opponent while the town watches, a mix of fear and morbid excitement hanging in the air. And here's a softer chuckle. Some ordeals were downright absurd, like balancing stones on the head or swallowing consecrated bread. These tests were meant to reveal truth, though often they just revealed endurance or sheer luck. Public trials were as much performance as justice. Crowds gathered to witness proceedings, occasionally offering commentary, sometimes cheering or jeering. Execution of law in public reinforced social norms, conveyed moral lessons, and entertained, though at someone's expense. Historians still debate whether spectacle outweighed fairness in these scenarios. Interestingly, the church gradually intervened, discouraging ordeals in favor of confession, witness testimony, and written contracts. But remnants lingered for centuries, especially in rural areas where superstition remained strong. The shift reflects a slow evolution from divine trial to reasoned judgment. You watch from the sidelines as an accused peasant gingerly grasps a glowing iron, hand trembling. Sparks fly, onlookers gasp, and a hush falls. You feel both relief and unease, realizing that medieval justice was unpredictable, sometimes horrifying, yet entirely sincere in its pursuit of divine truth. And your soft bedtime grin, at least today, courtroom evidence doesn't involve hot irons or dunking in rivers. Modern trials are far less singed. You leave the rowdy town square behind and step into a shadowed apothecary, the air thick with herbs, powders, and the sharp tang of dried roots. Shelves are lined with jars labeled in fading ink, their contents ranging from mundane to bizarre. Here, medicine, superstition, and experimentation blend seamlessly, and you quickly realize that medieval healthcare was as imaginative as it was hazardous. Here's the mainstream fact. Apothecaries prepared remedies from plants, minerals, and animal products, offering treatments for everything from fevers to digestive ailments. Knowledge was derived from classical texts, trial and error, and oral tradition. Historians still argue whether these remedies were mostly effective or relied on placebo, ritual, and hope. Now for the quirky tidbit. Some potions contained ingredients that sound downright odd today. For instance, powdered mummies, dried toads, or even parts of snakes were sometimes used. The logic was symbolic. Consuming a powerful creature, even in small quantity, might transfer its strength to the patient. You can almost imagine a peasant grimacing while sipping a potion and thinking, "I hope this actually works." Leeches, as in hospitals, were a common treatment. Bloodletting was believed to balance the body's humors, though sometimes the results were more dangerous than the illness itself. Apothecaries often guided these procedures, sometimes selling leeches or applying them directly. You picture the mixture of fascination and fear as patients trusted strangers with sharp implements and slippery leeches. Interestingly, remedies often included ritual components, incantations, prayers, or instructions to perform actions at specific times. A poultice might need to be applied while reciting a psalm, or a potion drunk under a full moon. Historians still debate how much efficacy came from the substance versus the ritual, though the belief was universal. And here's a soft chuckle. Some cures relied on animal byproducts like goat milk, crushed beetles, or owl fat. You can almost picture a villager holding a jar of suspicious goo, wondering if the owl is watching them for results. Apothecaries were also early pharmacists, keeping precise records of ingredients, dosages, and remedies, though consistency varied widely. Merchants and travelers sometimes brought exotic ingredients from far-off lands, adding spices, gums, and resins to the mix. The shop became a microcosm of global trade, curiosity, and superstition. By the time you leave, the scent of herbs lingers in your nose, and you realize medieval medicine was a delicate dance between observation, tradition, and imagination. Every poultice, potion, or charm represented hope, sometimes misguided, sometimes surprisingly effective. And your bedtime smile. In the medieval apothecary, the cure might be weird, but at least it was offered with care, attention, and a dash of mystery. You step out of the apothecary and into the cool evening air, finding yourself in a quiet village square where lanterns flicker and the smell of baking bread drifts from small cottages. People gather around a stage where a troupe performs a puppet show, or perhaps a morality play. Entertainment in the Middle Ages wasn't just for fun, it was moral instruction, gossip, and sometimes sheer absurdity rolled into one. Here's the mainstream fact. Traveling performers, minstrels, and actors were common in medieval towns. They sang songs, performed plays, and recited stories that educated, amused, or satirized. Festivals often included elaborate pageants combining music, dance, and dramatization of biblical or historical tales. Historians still argue whether these performances primarily reinforced social norms or provided a subtle critique of authority. Now for the quirky tidbit, puppets sometimes depicted animals behaving like humans, clerics misbehaving, or exaggerated caricatures of local nobility. A rabbit might lead a council meeting, or a fox might trick a bishop. You imagine the crowd laughing, whispering, and gasping in delight as puppets stage scandalous antics safely separated from real consequences. The boundary between humor and instruction was fluid. Storytelling extended to festivals and markets as well. Town criers, minstrels, and traveling bards brought news, history, and gossip, often embellishing facts for entertainment. You might overhear a tale of a dragon in a neighboring village, or a miraculous cure that involved a donkey and 3 onions. Historians still debate how much of this was believed versus enjoyed purely for spectacle, though oral tradition clearly shaped culture. Interestingly, music was integral to performance. Drums, lutes, and flutes accompanied dramas, while actors and puppets emphasized rhythm and movement. Even small villages staged mock battles or reenacted legendary events. You can almost hear the faint tune of a fiddle over the murmurs of the crowd, setting a lively, if slightly chaotic, backdrop. And here's a soft bedtime chuckle. Imagine a puppet jury deliberating seriously while a fox sneaks off with the plaintiff's wig. Medieval theater had room for satire, slapstick, and moral lessons, all in one. Performances weren't just entertainment. They educated children, conveyed civic values, and offered an outlet for communal anxiety. Festivals provided moments of joy and release in a life often defined by labor, risk, and superstition. Watching the puppets, you realize humor, imagination, and storytelling were as vital then as they are now, bridging generations and making life slightly more bearable. By the time you walk past the flickering lanterns and laughing villagers, you sense the medieval world in all its color. Fear, superstition, devotion, and delight intertwined seamlessly, shaping both survival and culture. And your bedtime smile. In the Middle Ages, even a rabbit on stage could teach a lesson, and maybe steal your wig. You wander into the quiet of night, the village streets empty, except for the occasional stray dog or distant owl. Your path leads to the town's edge, where the silhouettes of simple cottages and thatched roofs contrast against the dark sky. Here, in the calm after chaos, you glimpse the final shock of medieval life, the everyday coexistence of humans, superstition, and survival instincts that modern minds find almost unbelievable. Here's the mainstream fact. Medieval communities were tightly knit, with survival dependent on cooperation, knowledge sharing, and adherence to local customs. Daily life involved farming, craft work, religious observance, and navigating societal hierarchies. Historians still argue how much collective effort versus individual cunning determined a person's success or failure. Now for the quirky tidbit, superstitions permeated every aspect of life. People carried charms, recited prayers, avoided certain animals, and timed activities according to astrological beliefs. Some even believed that holding one's breath while passing a graveyard would prevent spirits from entering the body. Imagine villagers tiptoeing past tombstones, muttering incantations, while a cat arches its back and disappears into the night. Illness, hunger, and danger were constant companions. Yet medieval people found ways to cope. Humor, ritual, and community celebrations alleviated fear. Children played with rudimentary toys, adults shared stories, and fairs provided brief escapes from hardship. Despite the challenges, life was vibrant, adaptive, and deeply human. Historians still debate whether this resilience was a product of necessity, faith, or innate optimism. Death and superstition intertwined with practical life. Protective charms, amulets, and rituals coexisted with medicine, craftsmanship, and agriculture. You might stumble upon a small shrine by the roadside where villagers leave coins or food to appease spirits, an odd but sincere blend of belief and survival. And here's a gentle chuckle. Sometimes the most advanced technology was just trusting that a rabbit's foot or a few ashes in a wall would keep you alive. In a world where danger lurked everywhere, a little superstition wasn't irrational. It was clever. By the time you pause, listening to the rustle of leaves and distant hoot of an owl, the medieval world feels both alien and familiar. Humans striving, fearing, laughing, and surviving, just as we do today. It's a reminder that even in shocking circumstances, resilience, creativity, and a touch of humor endure. And your soft bedtime grin, but somehow, people made it work. The night wraps around you gently, a soft blanket of shadow and moonlight. You feel the day's imagery, the markets, forests, hospitals, and stage shows slowly fade into a distant hum, like echoes drifting down a quiet hallway. The smells, sounds, and sights you've carried start to blur into a calming haze, and the rhythmic pulse of life in the Middle Ages softens into something almost serene. Remember the streets full of pigs and mud, the cat perched on a queen's lap, the sparks of the blacksmith's forge, or the tiny shoes hidden in walls. Each detail, once startling or amusing, now feels like a whisper from the past, a gentle nudge reminding you that human experience is timeless in its mix of fear, hope, and curiosity. Even the odd remedies and superstitions begin to resemble small acts of care and ingenuity, born from necessity and imagination. You notice the shadows stretch long across the village square, the flicker of lanterns softened, the chatter of puppets and performers quieting. You feel the pulse of human endeavor, steady and patient, a cadence that moves from labor to leisure, from ritual to rest. All the shocks of the medieval world, the bloodletting, the charms, the eccentric inventions, fold into a quiet harmony, a testament to resilience and creativity. Let your thoughts drift, unhurried. The medieval world recedes, leaving behind warmth, curiosity, and a gentle reminder that history is a tapestry of ordinary people, strange customs, and enduring humor. You are safe, tucked in your own modern